World's climate pledges miss 1.5 degrees goal. Despite new climate pledges and a steady shift toward more ambitious national plans, the world remains far from its most critical goal, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The latest UN update shows that current national climate commitments, known as Nationally Determined Contributions, NDCs, would lower global greenhouse gas emissions by only about 12% by 2035 compared to 2019 levels. That's a fraction of the 60% reduction scientists say is required to keep 1.5 degrees within reach. Progress, but not enough. The UN Climate Change Secretariat's update now includes 113 countries, representing nearly 70% of global emissions. It reflects growing momentum. Most nations now set 2035 goals, cover all major sectors, and provide clearer data on how they plan to achieve them. But even with that improvement, the math doesn't add up. If all conditional targets, those dependent on international finance and technology, were fully met, emissions would fall by about 14%. But to align with 1.5 degrees pathways, the world would need to cut emissions roughly 5 times faster than current plans allow. UN Climate Chief Simon Steele welcomed the progress, but was blunt about its limits. The direction of travel is improving, he said, but the pace is nowhere near fast enough. What science says. This UN finding echoes a chorus of scientific assessments warning that time is nearly up. The UN Environment Programme's Emissions Gap Report 2024 concluded that, at today's pace, the world is on track for 2.5 degrees to 2.9 degrees of warming by the end of the century. To hold the line at 1.5 degrees Celsius, global emissions must fall 42% by 2030 and 57% by 2035, far steeper than the 12 to 15% cuts now projected. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, reached a similar conclusion in its landmark report, emphasizing that 1.5 degrees is still physically achievable, but only through rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes across energy, land use, and industrial systems. Meanwhile, research from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and Climate Analytics suggests that even a brief overshoot of the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit could trigger feedback loops. From ice sheet collapse to methane release in thawing permafrost, that lock in irreversible warming. In short, every tenth of a degree matters. What happens if we miss it? Missing the 1.5 degrees Celsius target doesn't mean an immediate catastrophe, but it does mean a more dangerous and unstable world. Scientists say a 2 degrees Celsius trajectory would intensify heat waves, droughts, and flooding to levels beyond many countries' adaptive capacity. At 1.5 degrees of warming, 99% of coral reefs are at risk of bleaching or collapse. Extreme heat will regularly exceed human tolerance in parts of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Sea levels could rise by half a meter this century, threatening coastal cities worldwide. At 2 degrees Celsius, those risks multiply. Ice loss accelerates, crop yields drop sharply, and hundreds of millions more people face water scarcity, displacement, and health threats. The difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees Celsius is the difference between serious disruption and unmanageable change. Why 2035 is the new battleground? Most countries now use 2035 as the benchmark for their next round of commitments, a midpoint that defines whether 1.5 degrees Celsius remains achievable or not. For businesses and investors, that date should carry as much weight as 2050. Stronger 2035 goals will shape carbon pricing, manufacturing standards, energy markets, and disclosure rules in the next decade. And for developing countries, access to climate finance will determine whether they can leapfrog to cleaner growth or remain locked into high-emission pathways. The UN notes that if conditional elements, funding, and technology transfers are not delivered, the emissions gap will widen further. The path forward, scientists agree that it's still possible to stabilize global temperatures close to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but it would require an immediate acceleration in renewables, a global phase-down of fossil fuels, large-scale investment in efficiency and electrification, and protection of natural carbon sinks. For companies, that means aligning strategies with deep decarbonization scenarios, not incremental improvements. Transition plans, procurement standards, and reporting frameworks must anticipate steeper cuts ahead. The next opportunity to close the gap will come at COP30 in Belém, Brazil, where countries will finalize their 2035 commitments. What they bring to the table will determine whether the world keeps 1.5 Greece alive or locks in a future defined by extremes. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites presented by E plus E Leader. For partnership opportunities, reach out to a member of our team.